me. I see my sheet and I realize what I forgot technologically. Okay, good. I think I did it. All right, so to start the Mishnah once more on Yudalad Amud Aleph. Beis Shammai Omrim. Beis Shammai say as follows. Tavlin niduchem b'madoch shaleitz. You could grind up spices in a normal fashion using a wooden pestle. V'hamelach, salt, if you want to grind it up on Yom Tiv, has to be ground with a shinui. You cannot go ahead and grind it up in the normal fashion. Rather, you have to grind it up with a shinui. That's what it means. V'hamelach, bepach, with an earthenware vessel, or be'etz haparo, or with a large wooden spoon. This is the position of Beis Shammai. Spices ground normally, salt ground with a shinui. Beis Hillel omrim. Beis Hillel, on the other hand, say, Tavlin nidochin kidarkon. They agree that spices can also be ground in the normative fashion, b'madoch shel even. That, interestingly enough, the truth is, Beis Shammai even says that even spices are ground a little bit with a shinui, right? A little bit of a shinui, because they're saying ultimately, again, you're using a madoch shel eitz, right? You're using a wooden pestle. Beis Hillel says, mamish, you can go ahead and grind spices in a totally normative fashion, even with a pestle made out of stone. V'hamelach b'madoch shel eitz. Salt should be ground with a wooden pestle. So here's what's coming out of the Mishnah. Everyone agrees that you could grind spices on Yom Tiv. Beis Shammai says use a little bit of a shinui. Perhaps instead of going ahead and using a pestle made out of stone, use a pestle made out of wood. Okay? Beis Hillel says you don't need any shinui. You could just go ahead and grind spices pretty much in the normative way. When it comes to salt, everyone agrees that you require some type of shinui. Beis Shammai requires a more dramatic shinui of not using a pestle at all, but rather using either an earthenware utensil or, for that matter, a wooden spoon. Beis Hillel says just use a different kind of pestle. What's going on over here? Says the Gemara. So what's happening here? Says the Gemara. The Kuli Alma, everyone agrees, Mihas Melach Baya Shinui. So we'll say the point that everyone agrees with in Mishnah is the grinding of salt requires a shinui. That's what everyone agrees with, right? Grinding of salt requires a shinui. My taima, what's the reason for this? Rav Huna b'Rav Chisda, Chad Amar Kol HaKederos Kulan Tzrichos Melach, Ve'ein Kol Kederos Tzrichos Tavlin. Very interesting. One opinion says the reason why everyone agrees salt requires a shinui if you grind it on Yom Tov. I'll say, now let's take one step back over here. Remember that the act of grinding is one of the lamed tes malachos, right? Tochem is a malacha. What's very important to remember is the malachos, the 39 malachos, apply on Yom Tov as well. Just the only difference on Yom Tov is what? Is ochel nefesh, which means things that ultimately, again, you need for food preparation activities are permitted. But even that is not a carte blanche, right? Instead, what the Gemara is going to say is like this. Why do you have to grind up salt with a shinui on Yom Tiv? Because listen to this. One opinion said, all food requires salt, and not all food requires spices. So what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Kol hakaderos, kol minei tavshel tzrichos melach. Hilchach me'esmol havayada di'iboy le leducha. Supposed to listen to this. Since every single dish requires salt, if there's one thing you know on Erev Yom Tov, it's what? It's what? You need salt, which means that you should have prepared it on Erev Yom Tov. So what the Gemara is saying is like this. When it comes to Ochel Nefesh, the only time you have a license to engage in malacha is if you need to do something that was unforeseeable on Erev Yom Tiv. But if you knew you were going to need something on Erev Yom Tiv and you failed to do so, you don't have the right to do that on Yom Tiv. Now, that being said, you have the right to do it on Yom Tiv, but how do you have to do it? How do you have to do it? With a shinui. So since everything's incredible, since everyone knows that you're going to need salt, right, you should have prepared Erev Yom Tiv. Therefore, if you don't prepare Erev Yom Tiv, halacha l'maisa, you can't grind it in a normative fashion. You have to use the shinui. Both say, what an incredible Musar Haskell, right? In life, you have to be roa as hanolad. In life, you have to look ahead. And failure to look ahead does not go ahead and just excuse incompetence. This is an incredible yesod. Sometimes things happen in life, like, oh, I can't believe it happened. Yes, you can believe that happened. I didn't think ahead enough. I didn't plan ahead. I knew this was going to happen, and I should have taken steps to go ahead and address this thing which was going to come up. Failure to think ahead, failure to be proactive, does not give you a license to just do whatever you want. I should have thought ahead when it comes to salt. I should have. I didn't do so. Okay, can you grind it up on Yom Tov? You can, but you have to do it in a non-normative fashion. The Chadamar, second opinion, says something a little bit different. Kala tavlin mafigin type. So remember, this is very important because whatever is going to be true for grinding is going to be true for other malachas as well. Although we'll see if that statement is true or not. But Lamaisa, the Gemara is potentially introducing us to a concept that maybe Ochel Nefesh only covers things that could not have been foreseen on Erev Yom Tov. But if you could have foreseen the need Erev Yom Tov, you should have taken steps then, and failure to do so will require me to then utilize a shinui for that particular action on Yom Tov. The Chadamar, the other opinion, says no. Kol tavlin mefigin taimun. Melach ina mefiga taima. The other opinion says no. The reason why you have to crush salt, grind salt before Yom Tov, but you don't have an obligation to grind spices before Yom Tov is very simple. Salt doesn't lose its potency or its flavor if ground in advance. Other spices do. Now, both according to this approach, the license to engage in malachas for ochel nefesh, that license is present when I could not have done the same thing before Yom Tov with the same qualitative results. Because once I think about this for just a moment, if you go with the we'll call it the rule, that anything that you could do before Yom Tov, you really have to do before Yom Tov. Can you cook before Yom Tov? Sure. Can you bake before Yom Tov? Absolutely. But yet again, you could cook before Yom Tov, but it's not the same as fresh food. You could bake before Yom Tov, but it's not the same as fresh bread. So this other opinion says as follows, that the difference between salt and other spices is the grinding of salt Erev Yom Tov yields the same qualitative result. There's no difference in the quality of salt ground on Erev Yom Tov versus salt ground on Yom Tov itself. That is not true with other spices. Other spices, I guess the potency is much more present when ground fresh as opposed to ground Erev Yom Tov. So therefore halacha l'maisa, both Beisham and Beis, although they disagree about how, will agree that salt has to be ground ahead of Yom Tov because halacha l'maisa can be done with the same qualitative results. So as it says the Gemara, my menayu. So what's interesting these two opinions? So remember, what's interesting over here is everyone is agreeing on the fact. The fact is salt needs to be ground before Yom Tov, spices do not. What's the difference? Why does salt have to be ground at Erev Yom Tov? So two different opinions. Opinion one is because halacha l'maisa, you knew you were going to need it. So anything you know you're going to need, you have to do in advance. Opinion number two is that the potency is unimpacted, right? The potency remains the same. So you could do it before Yom Tov with the same qualitative result. What's the principle between those two opinions? Ikebenayu, the yada my kedeya by libashule. So I'll say, interestingly enough, you know where this comes up? Where it comes up is if you knew which dish you were going to go ahead and cook on Erev Yom Tov. So we'll say, so right? So again, if I knew that I was going to be cooking a particular dish which required salt on Erev Yom Tov, that would require me to grind salt before Yom Tov. But according to the second approach, not necessarily so. Inam, the other possibility is bimorika, saffron. So apparently saffron is a spice where even if you grind it up early, it doesn't really impact the taste. So it could be then saffron would kind of be in the salt category, where halacha l'maisa, again, there wouldn't be a problem with going ahead and grinding it up early. Okay, so that's the nafkamina. I'm going to do Shmuel. So we'll say, so by the way, what we're going to see is la halacha, we pretty much adopt that second approach. We're going to see this, and that becomes a guiding light in Hilchos Yom Tov, which essentially tells me that I am allowed to do whatever I need to do on Yom Tov, assuming it could not have been done before Yom Tov with the same qualitative results. That's going to be our guiding light. We'll see that in the Shulchan Aruch over here, and we're going to see that concept come up over and over and over again. So the Gemara goes right to Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Kol hanidochin, nidochin kidarkan vafilu melach. Wow. Comes along Shmuel, and Shmuel says that halacha l'maaseh, anything that is ground could be ground in the normal fashion, even salt. So now Shmuel's statement seems to be at odds with both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, because although Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel are disagreeing about how you should do things, both are agreeing that salt should be ground before Yom Tiv. Comes along Shmuel and says, no, you could grind anything you want on Yom Tiv, even halacha l'maaseh salt. Amrit melach by shinui. But we learned that the grinding of salt requires a shinui. So who does Shmuel hold like? Hu da amar ki haytana. Shmuel holds like the following Tana. Disanya amar Rabbi Meir lo nechleku Beis Shammai Beis Hillel al nidochin shenidochin kidarkon umelach imahen. Listen to this Tana Bosai. This Tana is an alternate version, and this Tana says both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that halacha l'maaseh, anything that is ground can be ground in its normative fashion, including salt. So right on Yom Tiv. Lo nechleku ela ledocha bifnei atzma. Oh, listen to this. So I will say, Beis Shammai Beis Hillel say like this: once you're grinding spices on Yom Tiv, you could grind spices, you could grind salt, you could grind everything together. Now, I mean, I don't mean actually like everything combined together, but you could grind everything kind of in one circumstance together. Where's the machlokes? Listen to this. Lo nechleku ela ledocha bifnei atzma. The machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is: are you allowed to grind salt by itself? Shebeis Shammai omrim, Beis Shammai say like this: if you're grinding salt by itself, melach bepach ubeitz haparer litzliav alo likdeira. Beis Shammai says if you're grinding, if you're grinding everything together, you're doing one act of grinding. So you could grind salt, other spices all together. If you're grinding salt by itself, Beis Shammai says, first of all, you have to grind it in a non-normative fashion, which means number one, to go ahead and use either an earthenware utensil or a large wooden spoon, which is a shinui. Number two, litzli avalo l'kedira. So we spoke about this 2 days ago, which is you could grind the amount of salt you need for what? For roasting, but not for cooking. So remember again, there's a lesser amount of salt that is necessary for roasting than there is for cooking. So Beis Shammai says, number one, you can only grind a smaller amount of salt, and when you grind it, you must grind it with a shinui. Avalo look there. Beis Hillel say bechol davar. Beis Hillel say halacha l'maaseh. You could pretty much go ahead and grind it in any way, or l'chol davar. Rashi changes it here, l'chol davar. Va'afilu l'kedera, va'akarchach kedarka amri bechol davar. So we'll say, so ultimately it sounds like, according to Rashi, what Beis Hillel is saying is you could grind the salt in any way and for any reason. Bechol davar. Oh, thank you, say thank you. This is like surprise morning. What's coming out next? It's thank you. So what does it mean? What does it mean bechol davar? Right? What does it mean? The Gemara said bechol davar with anything. Bechol davar sagadaitcha ela ima lichol davar. No. Beis Hillel doesn't mean you could grind it with anything, because halacha l'maaseh you still have to do it with a shinui. Rather, what Beis Hillel says, you could grind it for anything, which means that halacha l'maaseh not only for tzli, but even for cooking as well. Amali Ravacha Bardala Libre. So Ravacha Bardala said to his son, Ki daichis atzli atzluye v'doch. So listen to this. Ravacha Bardala said to his son, if you're going to grind salt, this is talking about salt, on Yom Tov, here's what I want you to do. Atzle atzluye v'doch. Look at Rashi. We'll say it's almost right across in Rashi. Atzli atzluye v'doch. Hita hamaducha al tzida. The savar kishmod amar nidochas kidarka b'madoch shal aven umiu shinui zuta by the shul. Listen to this. We'll say Rav Acha Bardala essentially held like Shmuel, and Shmuel held that you could grind anything on Yom Tiv. You could grind anything on Yom Tiv, even salt. But Rav Acha Bardala said to his son, therefore, when grinding, you could use a stone pestle. But here's what I want you to do: use the side of the pestle and not the tip of it, right? They both say, right, in there you would normally use a pestle, as you hold it in your hand, right, lengthwise, and you crush down. So Rav Acha Bartla was telling his son, do me a favor, use a little bit of a shinui, and use the side of the pestle. So you could use a wooden pestle, but use the side of it, a little bit of a shinui. So Rashi points out, in essence, he's holding like Shmuel, that any act of grinding is permitted, but he's telling his son, employ a little bit of a shinui. Listen to this. Rav Sheshes, Shama kol buchna. Rav Sheshes heard someone grinding. Rashi says, b'meduchas melach. He heard someone grinding salt. So Amar, hai lav migave de beisayhu. So listen to this. So Rav Sheshes says, that's not coming from my house, right? That's right. That's not coming. That is not coming from my home. So the Gemara says, v'dilma atzluye atzle. Well, maybe it was, but maybe the person who was grinding the salt ultimately, again, was grinding it with the side of the pestle instead of the top of the pestle. The Shamei Dahavit Salil Kale. Ultimately, again, about say he heard that the sound of the pounding was very clear. I guess that there's a difference in the noise when you grind with the tip of the pestle versus the side of the pestle. Obviously, I will say they were sensitive to these things because this is how they were preparing spices. So Lamaisa, he heard based on the sound, that it was being pounded in a regular normative fashion. So he said, this is not coming from my home. But maybe it wasn't salt. Others also remember, again, according to Beis Hillel, you're allowed to grind regular spices, maybe non-salt, you're allowed to grind regular spices in a normative fashion on Yom Tiv. So maybe ultimately, again, it wasn't salt, it was regular spices, and that's why they were grinding in the regular way. Nabuche minabeach kalahu. So this is very interesting. So apparently, spices make a lot of noise. Or not spices make a lot of noise. It makes a lot of noise when you grind spices. So he heard, based on how everything was being ground, that someone was grinding salt in a normative fashion, and so he said, this is not coming from my house. Incredible. Tan Rabbanon, ein osin tisni vein koshin b'machteshes. So let's listen to this. You cannot make tisni. Now I know that's very disappointing for many. Right? You will say, so what's right? What's tisni? What's tisni? So take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Ein osin tisni b'yamtiv shetorach godolhu shekotesh hachitin ad shenechlokim alif la'arba. So apparently, tisni is this dish where you grind wheat kernels to the point, literally Rashi says, you take one wheat kernel and you break it into 4 pieces. So you're grinding up wheat kernels. You cannot make tisni. That's statement number 1. Ve'ein koshim makteshes. Nor can you go ahead and crush in a mortar. So the Gemara says, Tarti, are these 2 different halachas? In other words, isn't this the same thing? Hari kamar. Matam ein osin tisni. So the way the Mishnah says like this, why can't you make tisni on Yom Tiv? Lefi shein koshin b'machteshes. Because you cannot use a mortar on Yom Tiv. Again, I will say this is another opinion now. V'leima ein koshin machteshes. Why don't you just say that you can't go ahead and use a machteshes? And I will say, look at Rashi Mishlam Tarti. Shnei dvarim yeshkan. Lo zed dom lo zakatani ein osin tisni ha chilka v'daisa shapir dami dein tircha meruba v'hadatani koshin. I will say, tisni is very finely ground wheat kernels. There are other types of what we'll call pounded wheat products, like Rashi says over here, like daisa or chilka, which are not finely ground. And those also require the use of a mortar. So on one hand, you're saying you can't use tisni, and then you say you can't use a mortar. But yet, it seems to contradict you. You can't use tisni, but you can use other ground wheat products. But then you say you can't use a mortar, which sounds like it can't make any ground wheat products. So which one is it? So the Gemara says really they're related. Why can't you make tisni? Ultimately, again, because we don't go ahead and use a mortar on Yom Tiv. So the Gemara says, "Ai ve'ema v'leima in kosher machteshes." Why don't you just then make a declarative statement that we don't use mortars on Yom Tiv? You would have thought that only applies to a large mortar. But you might have thought maybe with a small mortar you are permitted to go ahead and use it. Kamash Rulan, the Beitzah wanted to say no mortar at all. No mortar at all. But we learned in koshim machteshes gidola, aval koshim machteshes kitana. But we learned elsewhere that that's not true. You only can't use a large mortar. but you can use a small mortar. Both say, let me pause here for just a moment to highlight something else. There's another subject that's unfolding over here that we're going to come to a little bit later in Maseches Be'ah, which is a fascinating dynamic. As much as we say ochel nefesh is permitted, there are certain malachas that are problematic. Which malachas? Things that are normally done as large-scale malachas. Those are problematic on Yom Tov because since they're normally done large-scale, the concern was that if we let you do that on Yom Tov, what's going to happen? It has the appearance, or it could actually be, that you're going to prepare for more than just Yom Tov, but you're going to end up preparing for post-Yom Tov as well. Just to keep in mind, one of the malachas that gives us some problems is the malacha of tochen, because often grinding was what we'll call a mass production malacha, right? People didn't just do grind. Usually, people didn't just do, even with spices, people usually didn't just do grinding just for, what you need right now. Usually, it was something larger scale. The Gemara hasn't mentioned that yet. We're going to see this, by the way, when it comes. The Mishnah is going to mention this more explicitly later on, but I'm just mentioning it to you now because that is what's driving a lot of this discussion as well, even though it has not been stated explicitly. That's why you see the Gemara making a distinction. What do you mean a large mortar and a small mortar? What does that mean? Why the distinction? Because if you begin to understand that in general, there's an underlying anxiety. There's an underlying halachic anxiety. Do we want people grinding anything on Yom Tov or not? The concern is it looks like, again, a mass production malacha. So just keep that in mind. Again, we're not going to grapple with that issue today, but I'm mentioning it to you because it could give you a little bit of context for some, again, the Gemara's underlying anxiety about this. The Gemara's so you wanted to say you can't use a mortar at all. But now we're saying, no, you can't use a large mortar, but you can use a small mortar. What's going on? Tanya Yerushabai says, you're right. That halacha l'maisa, it means, Abai says, it means that you cannot go ahead and use a machteshas gidola. So the large grinder is problematic, but the smaller grinder ultimately, again, will be permitted. Amud Beis. Rava Amar Lo Kasha. Rava says, so we're just trying to reconcile. We have two different statements regarding mortars, right? One statement says mortars mutter. One statement says mortars usser. So the way Abai wants to resolve it is not a problem. One is a large mortar, one is a small mortar. You could use the small mortar on Yom Tiv. You cannot use the large mortar on Yom Tiv. Rava says Lo Kasha, Hala and Bahalu. This is very interesting. Rava said it's not a contradiction, talking about two different regions. One is talking about for us in Bavel, and the other was talking about for the Jews of Eretz Yisrael. They both say, now what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Rava Amar, Li'olam matam kamra b'ktananami kai, v'ka'amar ein koshin klal. Hala, and Rashi says, the less lehu avdei dimizazli. Listen to this. So I will say, for us in Bavel, see, it's interesting. Apparently, the Jews of Eretz Yisrael, I guess, were a bit more affluent. They had servants. For the Jews in Bavel who don't have servants, ultimately, again, they are permitted to go ahead and use the mortar. For the Jews of Eretz Yisrael who have servants, they can't use the mortar. Now, what's the pshat? Look at Rashi. Halahu, the islu avdi, the mizalzali va'osin bigdola, va'omrim biketana asinu. Supposed to listen to this. So Rabba wants to suggest the Jews of Bavel who don't have servants, they could use a small mortar. The Jews of Eretz Yisrael can't use any mortars. Why not? Because again, I have a concern. They have unscrupulous servants, and the servants go ahead and use a large mortar. They say they're using a small mortar, and therefore the only way to take care of this is no mortar. No mortar. Good. So the Gemara says as follows: V'halu Rappapi ikla lebei marshmal. Bless you. Aisile daisa v'lo achol. Listen to this. So Rappapi went to the home of Mar Shmuel. They brought him daisa. They both say daisa. Daisa is like a type of porridge, right? That's made out of pounded grain. He didn't eat. He didn't eat, right? Vidilma, so the Gemara says, velo achal, so he wouldn't eat it. Why? What was his concern? His concern that maybe it was made in a large mortar. I vidilma machteshes ketana avduha, but maybe they made it in a small mortar, and the use of a small mortar ultimately seems to be mutter on Yom Tiv. Techazi dahava dayik tfei. He saw that the porridge was very finely ground. So I guess there's a difference in the grinding quality of a large mortar versus a small mortar. The point is, he saw from the way that the dish was prepared that halacha l'maisa, the porridge was made in a large grinder, so a large mortar. V'dilma me'esmal avdua. Maybe they made it yesterday. In other words, how do you know it was made today? Maybe it was made Erev Yom Tov, in which case it's not a problem. Techazye dehava kalif tzahare. Because I will say what happens. He saw based on the coloration of the daisa. Look at Rashi. Kalif tzahare tzohar mariso haya kalif v'lavan. Apparently, when grain is like freshly ground or freshly peeled, it has like white streaks. So the point is, he saw based on the dish that it was made today. Davakalev tzari v'ibay sema shiny beimar shmuel dika pritzusa da'avdi. Or unfortunately, it could be that the house of Mar Shmuel was a little bit different. Why? Because it was known that he had unscrupulous servants. He knew that he had unscrupulous servants. We'll say, a number of very, very important lessons you learn from this. When you go over to someone's house on Shabbos or Yom Tov, don't go into the kitchen. That's number one, right? Stay at the table, eat your food. Let your host worry about somewhere else. And also, but on a serious note, what you see from here is as follows. Isn't this incredible that this is Mar Shmuel? Yet Mar Shmuel had unscrupulous servants that he did not deal with. So I will say you have to be on top of what goes on in your house. Because sometimes things happen in my house and I turn a blind eye because I figure, you know what? It's okay, it'll go away or it'll take care of itself. Our problems never solve themselves. If there's something going on under your roof, get on top of it. And at the end of the day, take care of it. Because A, it doesn't go away. And second of all, everyone else will end up knowing about it as well. And ultimately, it doesn't just impact you. You can see over here, Mar Bar Shmuel invited over Rav Papi, and Rav Papi wouldn't eat in his house. I will say, and this is not like Rav Papi being a machmir and deciding, this is Rav Papi would not eat in Mar Shmuel's home. Why? Because Mar Shmuel had unscrupulous servants, which presumably he knew about, and yet didn't do anything to address. How many times do we walk through life with obvious, glaring issues, challenges, and deficiencies? We pretend like they don't exist. We pretend like no one else sees them. I know them. Everyone else knows them. And if I just found the courage to address them, to take care of them, how much better life would be. So before we go into the Mishnah, Shulchan Aruch, again, I don't have time to do this, halacha l'maisa, justice, but what I do want to tell you is this. This is Siman Taf Kuf Dalid Sif Aleph. So just take a look at the Shulchan Aruch, but here it is very quickly. Dochines atavlin kidarkam. She'im yaduch osam ba'od yom yafik taiman. Halacha number one, you can crush spices normally on Yom Tov. So we'll say this is very important because if you have a pepper grinder, you could use, right? Well, you could grind spices normally on Yom Tov. Why? What's the logic? Because the assumption is grinding spices before Yom Tov does not yield the same qualitative results as grinding it on Yom Tov itself. There's an assumption that fresh spices are better. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, you can grind it on Yom Tov itself. Aval, melach, eino nidoch b'Yom Tov, ele imkein hita machteshes, o sheyaduch b'ka'ara, ukiyotze ba k'dei sheyishana. Shimshacha kamelach b'erev Yom Tov lo yafik taimo. So we essentially adopt the position of Beis Hillel. You could grind spices on Yom Tov itself. You cannot grind salt. So we'll say, all seriousness, if you do have one of those things, you can't use that for salt on Yom Tov. You cannot grind salt on Yom Tov. Right, because ultimately, again, salt can be ground on Erev Yom Tov with the same qualitative results, but can grind spices on Yom Tov. Listen to this. He goes on, he gives other examples about palpulin, chardal, but we don't have to really start getting into that. Now listen to this. The Ramah says something a little bit different. And I'm about to say, here we go. Ha'umihu Noagin l'shanos kitzas b'dichas tavlin v'chein roi lahoros, excuse me. So ultimately, again, the Ramah says, but alocha l'maisa, whenever you're grinding spices on Yom Tiv, we always do it with the shinui. So the Ramah disagrees with the Mechaber. And the Ramah says really, whenever you're grinding spices on Yom Tiv, just employ a shinui, and he says this is indeed the best way to go forward. And the Mishnah Berurah comments and he says, "Hatam mishum diyesh post ga'achmir va'om gam betavon ma'afigin tam ein mutlo dochon b'yom tov kidarkon ela imkin lo yodem esmo." They both say, why would the Ramah be machmir and tell you that you should even grind spices with a shinui? Because he actually quotes, Mishnah Berurah quotes the first opinion. The first opinion says that, remember, the only time you have a license to go ahead and grind spices on Yom Tiv is when, first opinion, the interpretation is when you didn't know what you were making on Erev Yom Tiv, right? Then if you didn't know you were going to need it, you could do it on Yom Tiv. Mishnah Berurah says very often people know what they're going to need Erev Yom Tiv already. Well, I would think even if people cook on Yom Tiv, and we'll get to this, I just want to point out, the goal is to do as much preparation as you can before Yom Tiv. That's always the goal. The permit for Ochal Nefesh Shabosai, for a person to spend Yom Tiv preparing, for a person to spend Yom Tiv cooking, that's not the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to spend Yom Tiv. Ochal Nefesh is a license. It's a license. It's not an encouraged practice. What you need to do, you do. So bepashtos, a person knows, hopefully a person did the lion's share of preparation before Yom Tiv. But even if I didn't do the lion's share of preparation, the Ramah assumes you know what you're making. You know what you're making. So because you know what you're making, therefore, halacha l'maisa, you should have known which spices you need as well. And therefore, the Ramah says, in reality, if you're going to grind something on Yom Tiv, salt or other spices, halacha l'maisa, it should be done with a shinui. And I both say that is indeed how the Ramah ends off. So interesting. So for Svardim, the Mechaber says you could grind spices on Yom Tiv without a shinui. Without a shinui. Salt with a shinui, spices without a shinui. For Ashkenazim, we grind everything on Yom Tiv with a shinui. Fascinating. Both say, says the Mishnah, Habar kitnias b'Yom Tiv. If someone does borer, now both say, here we go. Someone does borer with kitnias on Yom Tiv. So which means, again, I have legumes. Kitnias are legumes. I have kitnias on Yom Tiv, and I want to go ahead and sort it out. Beishamai omrim, borer ochel v'ochel. So listen to this, Rabbi say. So again, for those of you doing smichas chaver, this is a little bit of a chazara as well. Borer. So listen to this. Beis Shammai says borer ochel va'ochel. Good. Rabbi say. Now remember again, the malacha of borer in general, in order to do borer, in order to be allowed to do an act of separation on Shabbos, you need three things. What are the three things? Right? Miyad, biad, ochel mitoch psolas. By hand for immediate use. Food from refuse, right? The stuff that you want from the stuff you don't want. So Beis Shammai says, on Yom Tiv, if you want to do borer, you could do borer, but borer ochel va'ochel, which means what? You can separate food from the stuff you don't want. So ochel mitoch psolas va'ochel, and you can eat it immediately. So Beis Shammai seems to indicate that you could do borer as long as you satisfy the normative three criteria. Ubeis Hillel omrim borer kedarko. You could go ahead and separate in a normal fashion. I will say now, bepashtos, when Beis Shammai says, and Beis Hillel says in a normative fashion, it means you could even remove the psolas, you could even remove the refuse, leave the food. Becheiko, in your lap. Bikanon is a funnel. Tamchui, large plate, which means you could even do it with a kli. Avalo betavlo, velo benafa, velo bekavra. But you can't go ahead and use a board, a sifter, or a sieve. So in other words, you could use a kli, but not a specialized borer kli. Right, so you can use a utensil, but not a specialized separating utensil. Gamliel says, "Af madiach v'shola." You could even madiach v'shola means you could even go ahead and saturate the mixture with water, and ultimately, again, shola, skim off, have the stuff float, and then skim it off. Again, we'll discuss exactly what that means in the Gemara. Tanya, Aram Gamliel. So let's listen to this. So Gamliel says as follows: now Beis Shammai is not a chiddush, right? Essentially, what Beis Shammai is saying is the halachos of borer on Yom Tiv are the same as the halachos of borer when? By Shabbos. So you need three criteria in order to engage in an act of separation. So you have to take out what you want, leave behind what you don't want. Biad, with your hand, without a utensil, and miyad for immediate use. Says Beis Shammai, those same halachas apply on Yom Tiv. Beis Hillel says you could actually remove the psolas. You could take away the refuse, leave the food. You could do it with a kli. So it says, when is that true that Beis Hillel allows this? Kisha ochel meruba ala psolas. That's only true if what? If there's more food than psolas. Now, both say, now what's the logic with that? Because if there's more food than psolas, then what? Then the removal of the food is actually what? More work, right? Think about this. If there's more food, more ochel than psolas, then to pull out the ochel is actually more laborious, right? It's more work than removing the psolas, right? There's less psolas, therefore less work to remove it. Aval psolas meruba ala ochel divrei hakol notas ochel meneches psolas. But halacha l'maisa, if there's more psolas than ochel, then ultimately again you take the ochel and you remove the psolas. In other words, even Beis Hillel, who says that you can go ahead and remove psolas from ochel on Yom Tiv, is only saying that in a case where there's less psolas, more ochel, so that the removal of the psolas is less tircha, it's less effort. But obviously, if there's more psolas than ochel, then you would remove the ochel, leave the psolas. To which the Gemara says, 1 second, psolas meruba ala ochel. If there's more psolas than ochel, Rabosai, mi ika man deshari. Listen to this. The Gemara says, this is wild. If there's more psolas than ochel, the Gemara says, then the entire mixture is muktzah. How does Rabosai? If the ochel is outnumbered by the psolas, then essentially the psolas becomes the rov. Once it becomes the rov, the entire mixture becomes pretty much unusable from a halachic perspective. So mikaman deshari lo tzricha denafish betircha v'zutar b'shiura. No. What's the case? The case could ultimately be, in the case, if you look at Rashi, denafish tircha, which literally means there's more effort but less volume. More effort, but less. Look at Rashi. Denafish betircha sheyeshno dak v'chikar medar murim. When is this? So bizman shetorach ha'ochel meruba al shel psolas. When does Beis Shammai allow you to go ahead and remove psolas, Rabosai? Where even though in a situation where there's more ochel on the psolas, but bizman shetorach ha'ochel meruba al psolas, there's more ochel, and therefore again, the tircha to remove the ochel is greater than the tircha to remove the psolas. Who dekar beisil nota psolas demeute betircha adif avalam torach psolas meruba al shel ochel divrei hakol. So we'll say, to which the Gemara is ultimately saying, no. We're always talking about cases where there's more ochel than psolas. So what are we referring to over here? Which has greater tircha? Beis Hillel essentially wants you removing whatever has less expenditure of effort. That's the goal. So ultimately, again, which requires the least amount of effort? The removal of the ochel or the removal of the psolas? But it always, and whichever one has less expenditure of effort, that's the one ultimately, again, that you'll remove from the mixture. But it has to be a situation where there's more ochel than psolas, because interestingly enough, at least according to the Gemara over here, if there's more psolas, by definition, the entire mixture becomes muktzah. So quite interesting. Rabbi Gamliel Omer af madiach v'shola. Rabbi Gamliel says you could even go ahead. Now madiach means put water there and skim off the psolas. Tanya Amar Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok. This was the minhag of the house of Rabbi Gamliel. What would they do? They would bring a bucket filled with legumes. They would pour water on it. And what would happen is the ochel would remain on the bottom of the bucket and the psolas would float to the top. It was an easy way of doing bor, and then they would just skim off the psolas. But we learned just the opposite, that the ochel would rise to the top and the psolas would go to the bottom. Lo kasha, it's not a contradiction. Ha ba'afra, ha begili. But say it depends on the kind of psolas. If you're talking about dirt sinks to the bottom. If you're talking about straw floats to the top. But the yesod is the same. This is how they would go ahead and do Barnabosai. Shulchan Aruch paskins like Beis Hillel. Now I want to point out, borer is one of these types of malachas that also creates a bit of halachic anxiety, just like tochen, because borer was also what we'll call a more mass production malacha. Yet despite that, we paskin like Beis Hillel, that halacha l'maisa on Yom Tiv, for ochel nefesh purposes, you are permitted to go ahead and engage in normative acts of borer. So in other words, on Yom Tiv, you would not need to comply with the 3 criteria of ochel mitok psoles, miyad, and biyad, as long as you're doing borer for an ochel nefesh purpose. Incredible. But let's at least begin the next Mishnah. Beishamai omrim in mishalchem b'yom tiv elamanos ubeisila omrim mishalchin behema chayev va'of bein chayin bein shchutin. But listen to this. Beishamai says on Yom Tiv, if you want to send a gift to someone, you could only send already prepared food. That's called manos. Rashi says elamanos. Davar hamuchan ve'ino asay lahanicho lemachar kigon chatichos basar chatuchos ifnei archim lechin dagim. So Beis Shammai says if you want to send a gift to someone, you could only send ready-to-eat food. Ready-to-eat food. Ubeisilo say no meshachin behema chayev va'of. You could send livestock behema chayev va'of bein chayim bein shchutin, live animals, slaughtered animals. Meshachin yeno shmanim v'salosos. You could send wine, oil, flour, kidneys, legumes. Avalot. Where does Beis Hillel draw his line? You can't send wheat. Now, why not wheat? Look at Rashi. Avalot tvua. She'ina ru'uya hayom she'in tochnin b'yom tov she'litchon me'esmo v'lo safik taimo. Oh, this goes back to last sugya. You can't grind wheat on Yom Tiv. But I say, why can't you grind wheat on Yom Tiv? Because wheat is a perfect example of saying that could have been ground on Erev Yom Tiv with the same qualitative results. So therefore, interestingly enough, Beis Hillel says pretty much you could send whatever you want, just not wheat. Avalot tvua, Rabbi Shimon matcha b'tvua. Rabbi Shimon says you could even go ahead and send it. Rabbi, so we have to stop over here for today. We'll pick up the B'nai Hashem with this Gemara tomorrow. Incredible sugyas ahead of us in the days to come. Shkoyach.